Okay, picking this back up. I want to look at these penicillins that are resistant to penicillinase. The initial one we come up with. We can put them into two groups: the methicillin, nafcillin, ancillin group. And these are all parenteral. And looking at them, methicillin, of course, is where we got the name methicillin-resistant Staph aureus from. Methicillin was always a pretty lousy antibiotic, not good plasma, not stable, hard to maintain a plasma concentration at all. So, nafcillin is the drug that's on your drug list. And nafcillin, one thing's a little unusual, it undergoes hepatic excretion. Very bottom we see these are penicillins that are stable to staphylococcal penicillinase. They won't work on others, but that applies to the isoxazole penicillins. Also applies to the nafcillin. So these are penicillins resistant to penicillinase put out by staph. Therefore, a big use, skin infections. By way of example, a cellulitis. This is where I see a lot of nafcillin used in a hospital. So when we look at staph, and this is kind of following the resistance pattern of it, we got penicillinase producing staph. And that led to these antibiotics. As we see on the next page, we see the next step of penicillin or staph resistance. Again, these have oral use down here at the bottom. They're pretty much the same as the ones at the top. And they also get used for skin infections. Anything else? I think I'll jump the gun a little bit here and just mention, note, you can also use a first generation cephalosporin. I'm just going to say ceph here. But a first generation ceph for staph with lactamase. I'll review that when we get to the cephalosporins. It's just kind of nice to tie it in together now. But which one do you want to use? Which is available? First generation cephalosporin or one of these drugs. For more serious infection, we need an IV administration. Nafcillin see a lot of use. Alright, the problem though with these penicillins that resisted the staph penicillinase was the staph didn't go down for long. They changed their target proteins. So they changed the penicillin binding proteins. And that's methicillin resistance. You're going to need a completely different antibiotic. Usually it's VANC that gets employed. So we've tried to restrict the use of these penicillinase producing or these penicillinase resistant penicillins, but it's spread. And now, of course, penicillinase isn't our biggest worry by far. There's other things that we worry about. So what we see now to this point, we see staph going to penase staph, then going to MRSA. And we'll just finish that. And we now see vancomycin resistant Staph aureus. So those are the 4 big generations of staph. And we do treat the MRSA. To treat MRSA, we use the same drugs that we treat VRE with, and we'll talk about the VRE drugs. I'll remind you of this. So, tigecycline could be used. I'm going to do more of daptomycin or linezolid, the ones that would come to mind. Tigecycline gets, I'm not sure if it gets MRSA or not, or MRSA. I'd have to look. I'm not sure about that one, Kevin. It's kind of one of those questions about spectrum versus indications. I don't see tigecycline used a whole lot. Looking at the gram-negative bacteria, different kind of yeast. For one thing, there's an outer membrane and there's a cytoplasmic membrane. So you've got 2 membranes. And that outer membrane is tough to penetrate. So you've got to have an antibiotic that can get through that. Fortunately, we've got these holes, these porins. And those porins are holes in the membrane to allow nutrients to gain access. So they're used for uptake of nutrients. That's important for the antibiotics. We think that's how they get in, at least in most cases. But of course, once an antibiotic gets in there, if it's a cell wall inhibitor, here's the peptidoglycan. So it's there. It's not as important as it was with the gram-positives, but it's still quite important. But notice you've also got the penicillinase sitting in here. So this penicillinase protects the peptidoglycan wall. So just because you get an antibiotic into this intermembrane space, it may get chewed up by the penicillinase. So you looking at this, you can start to say, this is why gram-negatives can be so tough. Yeah. Outer membrane is hard to get in there, get through, and if you get through, you might just get chewed up by the penicillinase. So, as I mentioned, the penicillins that first got some access into the gram-negative spectrum were the ampicillin, amoxicillin. We call these the aminopenicillins because all of them in this group have this amino group. Most of these we don't care about. We just care about amoxicillin and ampicillin. But that NH2 group, that amino group, helps penetration through the outer membrane. So obviously pharmaceutical companies have been playing with thousands of congeners of these. The ones we care about though, ampicillin and amoxicillin. That's actually the British spelling of amoxicillin. Here in the US, it's AMOXICILIN. So we've got these compounds that are resistant to, or able to penetrate and to kill some gram-negative, but of course they're still sensitive. Penicillinase. So a staph could easily chew them right up, and even an E. coli is pretty. Keep in mind, there's a lot of different strains of each of these. So a particular strain of E. coli doesn't express lactamase. You'd have to let's see. Well, I did circle. Thank you. But just because a bug is a staph or just because it's a E. coli, we don't really know what it's producing. And that's why you do ultra sensitivity results. But certainly if somebody has a skin infection, particularly if they got in a hospital, you can assume you're going to have to cover for staph that's producing penicillinase, and you're hoping you can get MRSA. Well, we still have this problem with penicillinase, so that leads us into these inactivators. of beta-lactamases. Clavulanic acid is one, sulbactam, SUL-BAC-TAM, sulbactam, tazobactam, TAZO-BAC-TAM. All of these are inhibitors of beta-lactamase. And clavulanic acid, the example I've shown here, it's actually an antibiotic. You look at that, it's a beta-lactam ring. And I really don't care about this process over here on the right, but look at what's happening. This enzyme, the penicillinase in this case, has a covalent binding. And that's the difference. So now the penicillinase comes in, bites on the same clavulanic acid, which is not a very good antibiotic, but the penicillinase is permanently bound, much like a transpeptidase is permanently bound. But this just shows the chemists like this, the transiently inhibited enzyme, just a little bit different form. We don't care about that. The point is, you've got a covalent binding. Therefore, you've got an inhibition of the penicillinase. And of course, these compounds have been enormously popular, adding them to amoxicillin and ampicillin. Let's look at the example shown here. Staph aureus is course gram-positive. Proteus mirabilis and E. coli are gram-negatives. And what we see with sodium clavulanate alone in a petri dish, you get some inhibition here. I can tell you that you don't get those kind of levels systemically well at all. So, actually, looking at this, it looks like when I compare sodium clavulanate to amoxicillin, it looks like clavulanate is better. It isn't. I'll just say in a petri dish it's better. But notice that looking at the ampicillin all alone, it doesn't do very well. But the ampicillin in the presence of clavulanate, look at that. So what we see here is a nice synergy. Again, 1 + 1 = 5. So with this in mind, we've had a lot of combination products. You will not be tested on the boards on these combo products. Just to let you know, though, Unison, UNASYN, that's ampicillin plus sulbactam. Zosyn, ZOSYN, which is one of the most commonly used antibiotics now, is piperacillin, which you'll learn about in coming handout, plus sulbactam, or plus tazobactam, excuse me. And of course, augment is clavulanic acid plus amoxicillin. But in each of these cases, what we get is a much better extension of the spectrum. And because of that, much better indication coverage. Augment will cover a whole lot more than just amoxicillin. Let's see, some notes on these penicillin variants. These penicillins can cause rashes, the ampicillin and amoxicillin. Quite often it's late therapy, and it's really more of a toxicity. Let's see. Did I just say good? It's just it's a buildup in the skin. You don't really know, though. It's in a rash, it's itching, so you kind of got to assume it was an allergy. There's usually good substitutes. Diarrhea, yeah. One of the problems with augment is you're going to need a lot of diapers if you're within pediatric situations. Really, really common with augment, that clavulanate plus amoxicillin. The other drugs, they're given IV. The ampicillin, sulbactam, that's IV, and the piperacillin zosyn, the piperacillin tazobactam is IV. So this oxazoloclavulanate is oral. Lots of diarrhea, lots of it. What occurs here, though, you're disrupting the gut flora dynamics. And unfortunately, you can cause an overgrowth of Clostridium difficile. It will survive that, and kind of the balance of nature of the gut gets disrupted. So the difficile will put out a toxin which damages and the intestinal mucosa, resulting in a massive diarrhea. So to treat such a condition, and I'll come back to this a couple of times. Vancomycin has become one of the best ways to treat Clostridium overgrowth. There's other drugs that can use, but don't try and slow down the intestinal motility. No loperamide. It may very well be that the patient had some diarrhea, so they tried loperamide, but that just held the toxin in there. And just because you get diarrhea while you're on an antibiotic, it doesn't mean it's Clostridium. This Clostridium usually expresses itself weeks or months after the therapy. But a child or even an adult will get diarrhea on the first day. It doesn't mean that they've got Clostridium difficile going. But if somebody's now having bouts of diarrhea, it's been several weeks or months, that Clostridium survived the antibiotic and started overgrowing, and with time, kept picking up, and it became this massive problem. Okay, let's look at the second handout because that's easy. I want to get through these cell wall inhibitors and into the protein synthesis inhibitors this evening. But look at this last group of penicillins. Active against the Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Pseudomonas is a nasty hospital pathogen. And particularly in somebody who's immunosuppressed, or if they're just in the hospital setting, they're very susceptible to this. Nothing we've talked about so far is going to get Pseudomonas. So we've got to come up with these anti-Pseudomonas penicillins. Ticarcillin is the one on this page that I would say is worth knowing. Carbamazepine, and danisodium used for UTIs. Not as useful, so I'm not as concerned about them. But what we see is a pretty big, bulky R group in each of these cases, particularly on the danisodium form. It's like, whoa. Let's see, quite often the ticarcillin is combined with clavulanic acid. I have not seen them given apart. I've never seen ticarcillin given by itself. Anytime ticarcillin was given, it was given with clavulanic acid. Typin was the trade name. But there's a hitch here. The clavulanic acid, as great as it is, it will inhibit a lot of lactamases. It'll inhibit lactamases. There's 6 classes of them. But it inhibit lactamases 2 through 6. But Pseudomonas as class 1. So unfortunately, it doesn't help as much. Clavulanic acid will not help for a Pseudomonas infection. So why do they bother putting clavulanic acid in there? Because these drugs are used for a lot of gram-negative aerobes. It's not just Pseudomonas. So clavulanic acid is not helpful. Pseudomonas aeruginosa. But let's take a look at the table down here, these different microorganisms. E. coli all the way down to staph, not including staph, of course, are gram-negatives. And then we have the gram-positives. And the group D spec is now, of course, called the Enterococcus. Well, look at this table. The first thing you notice is, well, look at penicillin. When penicillin works, and there's not a lactamase put out, and it's a gram-positive, look at the tiny amounts that you need. Versus, you go to the far right here, carbapenicillin, or we could just scratch that out and put in ticarcillin. Big doses. And that's the loss of potency because of that bigger R group. But notice how, look at all the 80s and 90s. Good gram-negative coverage, not everything. But we can't even talk about penicillin G in these gram-negatives. Ampicillin, well, what does ampicillin get? Ampicillin will get E. coli, it'll get salmonella, it'll get proteus. So you might say you can use ampicillin or amoxicillin. You'll certainly get staph, strep. They do pretty well against a lot of the enterococci. Those are all gram-positive. But as far as the gram-negatives, we're looking basically at E. coli and Proteus mirabilis. These are common for UTIs. And that's why you see ampicillin and amoxicillin used for UTIs a lot. They can also be used for strep throat because of the gram-positive coverage. And lastly, they get salmonella. But other than that, as far as gram-negatives, there's not great coverage there, not compared to that far right column with the ticarcillin type drugs. Okay, for years, let's go to the next page. There at the VA, we used ticarcillin combined with the clavulanic acid and time and time again. That's all we ever used. And I always kind of wondered, it's like, you're not even in the notes telling students there's these ureopenicillins that are very highly effective against Pseudomonas, Klebsiella, and Proteus. That stuff sat on the shelf there until it expired. I mean, it was never used. And I was like, why? Why aren't we using this? We can say that these are equal to ticarcillin, but they're at least very similar. So why aren't we using this? And the piperacillin, as I mentioned, has the tazobactam, versocin. But suddenly, like within one summer, the whole thing switched. And now the ticarcillin sat on the shelf until it expired, and the piperacillin just took off. And I was like, oh goodness, what happened? Did a really, 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 really pretty drug rep come through here? And I went to some of my clinical friends, and they kind of shook their heads, and they go, we're not sure, Brett. But really what happens is you get one advantage on one bug, and boom, that spells the difference. Look at ticarcillin and look at piperacillin. They're very similar, except look at that difference in Klebsiella. And once that was realized, boom, suddenly, why use ticarcillin? It doesn't cover Kleb. So, that's a big advantage of this compound. We also do a little bit better against the Pseudomonas. So both those put together, why use the ticarcillin? Which brings up the original question, why did we use the ticarcillin in the start? Maybe this just wasn't realized. I'm not sure. Notice on the far right over here, are the aminoglycosides. They are the gold standard for gram negatives. Look at all those hundreds there. Gold standard for treating gram negatives. Unfortunately, they're quite toxic, and in a way that's good. We don't use them much because of that. We'll talk about the toxicities of the aminoglycosides, but because we're not using them much, they're still quite effective. So something in our armamentarium that we're not using that hopefully will be around for a while. This table doesn't show it, but when there's also good activity against Enterococcus, and staph, when the tazobactam is added. So the tazo may not help much against the Pseudomonas, but again, we use these drugs for more than just gram negatives, or for more than just Pseudomonas. So what we see here was the ticarcillin, piperacillin, tazobactam is a drug that gets a lot of gram negatives, does really well, gets Enterococcus, and will get staph. If you were to walk into a typical hospital IV room in the pharmacy, you would see a big stack of all the antibiotics, big, yay high, of all the antibiotics. And then you see another stack placed on the side of all the antibiotics of the tazobactam, piperacillin, the Zosyn. These are almost equal. In other words, this antibiotic, piperacillin tazobactam, is used about as much as all the other antibiotics put together. That's not too much of an exaggeration. I might be a little off on that, but it's close. So, and I'm sure in the next 5 or 10 years that's going to change. But right now, we use an awful lot of this because we get gram positives, gram negatives. Therefore, it's very useful for empiric therapy. You're waiting for the culture and sensitivities to come back. Hopefully, you took the cultures before you gave the antibiotic. But the blood was taken, or the urine was taken, whatever, and then the drugs were administered. So, and as I've noted down here, we do combine these drugs with aminoglycosides, and we get a nice synergism when we do that. Okay, this next page looks like kind of a gruesome page, but what I want you guys to get out of it is actually pretty simple. It's a nice reminder of how these drugs are used in terms of their routes. So, for example, PNG, yes, we don't get PNG orally. We'll put it next to that one. But we certainly can use it intramuscularly or intravenously. The procaine and the benzathine, these are suspensions. I mean, you've got undissolved drug. It's in clumps. Therefore, it's intramuscular only. Let's see. Penicillin V, yeah, that should be oral. Because it's the oral PNG. You guys see where I'm going with this. It's actually a nice repeat, just kind of a sum up of what we've talked about. Cloxacillin, dicloxacillin, oxacillin. These should really be used orally. Yeah. We're shown here. But the oxacillin, I've never seen it used any other way. It's oral. The methicillin, which is not on our drug list, the napcillin. Scratch out oral. It's really got to be parenteral. And the ampicillin, yeah, you can give it orally, but nobody would anymore. Ampicillin has to be parenteral. The amoxicillin, of course, the only reason we have it is because of its oral use. And then the last one's down there, the ticarcillin down to the azlocillin. These are parenteral administration. Somebody that needs one of these is going to be in a hospital. So, parenteral only for a serious gram-negative infection. Possibly a gram-positive also, but we really focus on gram-negative. Once you've isolated the organism and it's gram-positive, you may not want to use the piperacillin. There may be something better to get it. Keep in mind, just because a drug has really broad coverage, it may not be the best at a particular bacteria, and a particular strain of that bacteria. And that's why you do cultures and sensitivities. Those come back, and they'll simplify things quite a bit. Okay, kind of a nice summation of the adverse reactions to penicillin. The allergic reactions. The beta-lactams combine to human proteins. They create this immunogenic beta-lactam hapten. Yeah, it's very immunogenic. Certainly can be fatal. Watch out, you guys. I got extremely lucky on this. My doctor got extremely lucky. The doctor put in an order for ticarcillin. He missed the penicillin allergy. I missed it. About an hour later, a friend tapped me on the back and said, "Brett, did you check the penicillin allergy on this patient?" I went, "What?" Oh, good grief. The guy had had an anaphylactic reaction before. I called the doctor. He was very chagrined, but we both felt extremely lucky. We could have killed that patient, you guys. When you see the antibiotics in general, immediately think of allergies, because it's just such a big deal here. Allergies you want to know anyhow, but for any drug, but it's particularly with these beta-lactams, be very, very careful. And don't depend on luck like I did. Anyhow, some other things. Skin rashes can certainly happen. Diarrhea, yeah, very, very common. For the most part, this is just bothersome. But it's not going to lead to a Clostridium difficile. Very, very common during the therapy. It's when the therapy is over and there's still diarrhea that there's a concern. Seizures, CNS effects, blockage perhaps of GABA results in decreased inhibitory transmission of GABA. This is what's really high plasma concentrations. Some hematologic changes, neutropenia, anemia, even some drug-induced fever, nephropathies can occur. It's listed here, but I'm not as interested in it. For information only. But I'm taking away through. I'm going to add one though, and that is be aware that these compounds, because you're given the newer ones, these the zosyn and piperacillin in such high concentrations, that you can cause salt disruptions, electrolyte problems. So you can get a sodium overload with the impotent penicillins. Something like the piperacillin. But that's it for the penicillins. Look at the cephalosporins. Things get messy, I'll agree. Part of the reason they get messy with the cephalosporins is there's two R groups. And because you've got two R groups, it's easier to have more congeners, more analogs. So two R groups frequently, as you might guess, is going to lead to more drugs. And there's a lot of cephalosporins out there. What else on here? Yeah, We've also got a carboxyl group, which means we might get renal secretion. By the way, you guys, when is renal secretion helpful? I keep making it sound like it's a bad thing. Why would we want renal secretion? I'll come back to that, George. But why would we want a drug to be renally excreted? No. Well, that's true. Yes. But I'm talking about not just glomerular filtration. Yeah, exactly. Renal secretion is very useful when you're treating UTIs. You get a very high concentration in the urinary tract, all the way through the bladder. So, in some ways, if you're treating a systemic infection, you don't want that renal secretion. On the other hand, we've got some great antibiotics for treating UTIs, but they don't go into the urine. You can't use them for a UTI. So keep in mind, some of these drugs like penicillin G, amoxicillin, ampicillin, they get a lot of renal secretion with those, a lot of renal elimination. Looking at these different cephalosporin groups, and let's keep in mind the pneumonias as we go down through this. Strep pneumonia is a big one. Klebsiella, the Haemophilus influenza, and 4, Mycoplasma pneumoniae. Those are 4 of the biggest pneumonias. And of course, the last one there we're not going to get with the beta-lactam. There is no cell wall. So right away, we know we've lost those. But let's take a look at these. There's on this page, I've got first, second, and third generation. Next page, I mentioned the 4th generation very, very briefly. The 5th generation, the ceftaroline, I haven't put in there. I'm not seeing it because we're absolutely holding that drug for an absolute need. Somebody needs it, but to this point, we've seen very little of it. But what is it that demarcates these different generations of the cephalosporins? Well, this first generation, if we look at what you get, all right, staph, strep, and even some anaerobic strep. So, additionally, and as I mentioned earlier, the staph here, whether it's Staph aureus or the Staph epidermidis, this first generation will resist galactomates from the staph. So, a staph or a strep, we're looking at skin infections here. We also pick up E. coli, club, and Proteus. These are quite often causes of UTIs, particularly the E. coli and Klebsiella too, and the Proteus. So, when I think of this first generation, I think of skin infections. They can be used for other things, but that's where you see a lot of use of them. What are the drugs you need to know? Well, the ones in black are the ones that it says stable acid permitting oral administration. Cephalexin's huge. You go into an ER these days and you've got some sort of a cut that needs to be sewn up, or any kind of sign of a skin infection. Cephalexin's probably what they're going to cover it with. But in terms of IV, cefazolin gets a lot of use. It gets used before surgery. Give somebody a good dose of cefazolin before surgery. It's in their skin. Therefore, as you're cutting through their skin, you'll avoid hopefully avoid infections. But what we see here is mostly gram-positive. So, those are the two first generations to know. The second generation, look what we've lost. We've lost the staph. We still get the strep. We still get the anaerobic strep. So, we've lost some staph, or lost some gram-positives. But we've picked up the Haemophilus, the Neisseria, and the Enterobacter. So one of the ways that people can think about this is we picked up hen. And if you go back up above there, what do we have? We have Proteus, E. coli, and Klebsiella. We can think of this as peck. So what have we got with the second generation? We picked up hen, and we've kept Proteus, E. coli, and Klebsiella. So the second generation have hen peck. It helps a little bit, I know. So what we basically see here, though, is we've lost our staph. We get some gram-positive, some gram-negative. Sort of a mix. Drugs to know. Cefaclor is the one that's mentioned there for oral administration. But years ago, Haemophilus became pretty resistant to it. So I'm not seeing a lot of second generations being used. So, let's say cefotecan. These three, I'm not sure which ones offhand I put on the drug list. I will mention, though, the cefoxitin. It has some special use because the cefoxitin is good for anaerobes. Things like B. frag, Bacteroides fragilis. So cefoxitin, second generation, parenteral, also gets some good anaerobe coverage. When we go to the third generation, we really don't use these for staph or strep. Everything listed there, be careful, Brad. Everything listed there is gram-negative. So, you'll see a lot of these used in a hospital. Very, very heavily used. Let's see, ceftazidime. I don't want to say it's the only drug of choice for Pseudomonas, but it's one of the best. Very good activity of ceftazidime against the Pseudomonas. So, which would you use against Pseudomonas? Ceftazidime, or maybe ticarcillin, piperacillin with nitazoxanide? Depends on what culture and sensitivity show. Probably both, hopefully, will work. But you might find that one's a little bit better. I'll just say good activity here. The ceftriaxone has a very long half-life, which has made it useful for a couple of things. One, it does get strep, staph and strep. So you got a compound that gets staph and it gets strep. Plus it gets a lot of these gram-negatives. So it gets the Haemophilus influenza. It's also going to pick up the Klebsiella pneumoniae. When we think about that, it's like, hold on, we get staph, we get strep. Strep pneumoniae, Haemophilus influenza, Klebsiella pneumoniae. For respiratory infections. So that's a big use of ceftriaxone, this respiratory infections. It also, though, as I said, has this long half-life, a long duration of action. It's one of the best drugs for treating neisseria. It has a long half-life. I'm not going to go ahead and say drug of choice here. It's one of the very best for treating neisseria. Excuse me guys, I drew that incorrectly. Ceftriaxone. Ceftriaxone is what you would use for the neisseria. So, does this get messy? Yes, but if you work on this for a little bit, it does kind of clean up. It's like, what would you use for a really serious gram-negative infection? Well, you probably have to go with third-generation stuff. Then they came out with the fourth generation, which is a little bit better, pick up the gram-positives again. Sulfapime is the only compound that's mentioned there. And there is a fifth generation these days. And it gets gram-positives, gram-negatives, and it gets Versa, which is a big push. But like I said, we haven't seen it used. I might go ahead and spell it out, but it's not on your drug list. Ceftarline. Well, unfortunately, we're not using it much. Okay, let's take 10 minutes, come back, we'll finish this up, and get into the aminoglycosides, and then call it quits for the evening.
There, I'm Dr. Zimmerman.